Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jordan Paris Show. Today, we're talking about a grave issue, an issue that's very, I believe, of the utmost importance. I know my guest would agree, it's China. I believe that China's not just America's greatest threat, but really the greatest threat to humankind as a whole. And I don't think that that's too much of a stretch to be able to say that. And here with me to discuss this today is General Robert Spalding. He was an Air Force general. You flew the stealth bombers? Is that correct?
That's right. Yep.
Very cool. I remember as a kid just looking at those, being in awe of those. What is it? I'm dying to ask. Like, what is it like flying that thing?
Well, it's actually pretty cool. It's like a giant flying computer, and it's extremely capable as a weapon system. Probably the most capable weapon system in the world. You know that you can fly just about anywhere and drop weapons. So it's pretty neat.
So, General Spalding, your book, which I'm currently in the middle of, was captivated just by the Audible preview, the 5 minute preview on their stealth war, how China took over while America's elite slept. And at Robert underscore Spalding on Twitter for people to follow you there. Now, I just want to cut straight to it here. Like, why is this issue of China important for everyday people to care about, Robert?
Well, not only has the Chinese Communist Party managed to influence nearly every major corporation in the United States and other free societies around the world, they have influenced our financial system, so our investment banks, they've influenced our universities, our academic system, they're also influencing our political system. And as we found out in 2020, they're influencing our medical establishment as well. So, World Health Organization, Centers for Disease Control, National Institutes of Health. So, lockdown policies, a lot of the things that we did as a result of the coronavirus comes not from, actually science or data, but comes from policy that was made within China and then replicated around the world. So, what we've seen in 2020 is just a real example of what the Chinese Communist Party's People's Liberation Army calls unrestricted warfare. It's really about influencing the economic, the social, and the political behavior of free societies to get them to slowly erode the principles and values that underpin those societies.
Regarding their medical influence in the U.S., do you believe that, would you go so far as to say that China targeted the United States with the virus?
Not just the United States, nearly every free society. And if you look at lockdown
You believe that
policies,
this is a weapon more than anything else,
it's an
used intentionally.
it's an information weapon. It was really used. So go back to the very beginning of when the pandemic became to be known. There was a study put out by Imperial College of London that called for over 2 million Americans to die. So they believe that report said over 2 million Americans are going to die because of the coronavirus. Of course, nothing like that ever materialized. But it's interesting to note that in 2015, Xi Jinping made a visit to Imperial College of London and gave them millions of dollars to do medical research, including epidemiology research. So the university that put out the report that said that scared many in the CDC and NIH and many Americans was put out by a university that was paid by the Chinese Communist Party to do that research.
Hmm. I want to get to actually to the lockdowns too. Uh, you mentioned that in passing. Why do they want the world to lock down? Is that something that they want the United States and the rest of the world to do? What influence do they have in regards to lockdowns?
So if you go back to the beginning of 2020, there was a trade war happening. It was beginning to see declines in the manufacturing output of China. And so what the lockdowns did, was actually to increase the reliance on Chinese industrial base in order to produce the things like PPE and masks and other things that the rest of the world needed. Now, the rest of the world shut down their factories. What the Chinese Communist Party did was, they had a short lockdown and then they opened everything up and really became, even more ensconced into the global supply chain as a result of everybody else shutting down.
And what is really the threat to the United States in regards to China? I mean, what do they want? We're having this information war, they're this stealth war really where we're in a war, but no shots are being fired. It's a very different war than in the past. I mean, what do they want from us? Are they looking to conquer our territory? I mean, what is it here? What is the long-term goal?
So when you think of China and the long-term goal, what you have to recognize is that the Chinese Communist Party controls China. So the Chinese Communist Party's long-term goal is to stay in power in China. Now they're a political organization and they have political power and they have economic power as a result of that political power in China. Now their subjects, the Chinese people, don't know about the outside world. There's a great firewall. They have propaganda at each grade level. The Chinese Communist Party controls the media, controls the internet, and so what the Chinese Communist Party believe is what the Chinese people believe is what the Chinese Communist Party tells them. And so the Chinese Communist Party is concerned. They're worried that the Chinese people would somehow gain knowledge about the outside world, about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, about the political liberties that Americans and other free societies or citizens of free societies enjoy. So their fear is democracy. And what they don't want their people to understand is what are the benefits of democracy. So what they want to do is suppress democracy outside of China to preclude their citizens becoming aware of it. It's not that they want to conquer territory, they just want America and other free countries to be like them. They want America to be controlled by a politically powerful elite that basically keeps the citizenry mollified and really unthinkingly supportive of the political system that they have control of.
So America is a threat to making Chinese citizens aware of democracy and freedom. They just don't want that shining example of democracy. They want to wipe that out because they want total control. They're complete control narcissists.
Right. If you go back to the Tiananmen Square, they made a replica of the statue. The students made a replica of the Statue of Liberty in Tiananmen Square. Now and those protests were going on all over the country. So the Chinese Communist Party used the People's Liberation Army, which is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party, to violently put down those protests. And their concern is that somehow, after gaining and reinforcing their power, that somehow those ideas could make their way back into China, and so they need to make sure that they just don't exist anywhere, because if they do exist, those ideas of freedom and liberty, then they create problems for the Chinese Communist Party's continued rule of China.
Hmm. General Spalding, what about, you mentioned in passing as well banking? And I know that you have an example in your book. You mentioned Morgan Stanley at one point in the beginning. What example do you have as far as their influence over the banking sector here in the States?
Well, there's a lot of different issues with regard to banking. So, for example, if you're a U.S. company, you have money invested in China, you can actually bring the money out of the country. So China has what's called a non-convertible currency. In other words, you cannot freely trade renminbi anywhere in the world. The only one that can actually exchange renminbi for other currencies is the People's Bank of China. And so that enables them to restrict the outflow of capital from China and control that strictly. And so they also have what's called strict capital control. So they prevent the outflow of currency. Now that distorts economic activity. For example, when you have two countries that are trading and one country is exporting far more than it's importing, usually what you have is what's called a countervailing currency trade. So there's a trade for products and there's a trade for currency. And that trade for currency tends to increase the prices of the goods that are, being exported from the country that exports more. And that tends to over time balance out the trade. So the way that you have balance of trade is that you have that countervailing currency exchange that free currency exchange that allows for that. Because China has set up this closed financial system, they can continue to export far more than the U.S. Exports to China to the U.S. and really undermines the U.S. economy in terms of productivity, manufacturing. So they have a system that really preferences Chinese manufacturers over U.S. manufacturers by continuing to export far more to the United States than the U.S. is able to export to China. So that's just one example. Other examples are that their Chinese companies that are listed on U.S. stock exchanges aren't required to be audited like U.S. companies. That's something that our Securities and Exchange Commission has allowed to go on for decades. And then finally, companies like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan make enormous sums selling Chinese stocks and bonds to U.S. institutional investors. Those are pension funds. So basically, many people's retirements are going into Chinese companies, and the ones that are making money in addition to those Chinese companies are U.S. companies like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and Citibank. So this is a structural problem in the global financial system, in the global trading system, that really tends to erode economic activity in the United States and causing job losses, millions of job losses over the last 3 decades. And it causes jobs to be created in China, really good jobs, jobs that allow them to, send their kids to school and have a home. So it's really about the destruction of the middle class and the lower class, because the Chinese Communist Party has created this economic and financial system that's designed. And the reason they did that was because if they didn't provide jobs to the Chinese people, then their continued rule as a political party over China would be challenged.
And speaking of job losses, it seems like so much of almost all manufacturing happens in China. You have iPhones being made in China. Everything that says made in China, like the amount of manufacturing jobs in the U.S. are just dwindling. How does one go about fixing this problem, and who fixes this problem? Especially when, any logical for-profit company is not going to be like, oh yeah, let me just do this and slash my profits in half. Like, it's not that easy. How does one fix this problem? And is it, in a two-part question, is it dangerous to be dependent on the Chinese for manufacturing all these different products?
So I'll answer the second question first. It's absolutely dangerous. For instance, you have the supply chain of our F-35s, which relies on components that come from China that have issues with them in terms of quality. They have ways that the Chinese Communist Party could potentially get into the F-35. And so that's one challenge. Now, when you scale that across the country, and you realize that we're dependent on China as a nation, then China can say, "Hey, we're not going to give you this product." They did that to Japan, and it was really about, in that case, it was about rare earth metals, which are needed to produce electronics. So there's a lot of different things that we are reliant on China for. That if they were to be cut off, basically you could see the society come to a standstill. Large power transformers is another example. So when you're so reliant on a country to produce the things that you need to keep the country going, if that country either decides to stop producing those things, or because they've embedded things in there that allows them to control things like the grid, then they can shut the lights off. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities built into our society now. They're based on the fact that we don't manufacture our own things. And then, the last problem is really what happens to the society. So the jobs that we depended on are gone. So now no longer do the people in communities have employment. And so it really becomes a problem for the rest of society as they try to pay for, to support the people that no longer have jobs. So it's a big problem.
And how does one go about fixing that problem? Is there an answer that's easy to explain, or is it way too complex?
No, it's very simple, and it's really doing the same thing that we did during the Cold War to the Soviet Union. We just cut off their
Mm,
ability to access our economy, to trade with us, to use our financial system. Now, people say, well, that's too harsh, but it's because they don't understand what the Chinese Communist Party wants to do.
they
They
don't
want to
understand the
use
threat.
Right. They want to use our society and the openness of our society to essentially undermine our society. So and that's why I wrote my book, because I really wanted to wake people up to the challenges we face. Because if they understand the challenges, then they can begin to, tell their politicians that, hey, it's time to break this connection and protect the United States.
So they really want to conquer us economically and ideologically rather than conquering our territory per se, which by the way, I'm not completely sold on. I have a feeling that they're over the next 100 years, they're probably coming for our territory. Just a hunch.
Well, when you think about it, if we voluntarily give up our freedoms like we did during the coronavirus, do that during 2020, then they don't really have to. As long as we are subdued, and if we subdue ourselves just by voluntarily choosing not to live as a free people, then they achieve the same goals. If Americans no longer recognize that it's much better to live in a free society than it is to live in an authoritarian one, and they choose to say, hey, we want to live in an authoritarian society, as I've heard many people say, then in reality, the need for them to invade really is no longer there. They can work with the leaders of the
Right.
country who are in charge of the country to get them to do the things that they want.
Yeah. And in regards to the leaders, how many in our United States government are in China's pocket?
Well, it used to be a lot more, and really it doesn't matter about political party on the right and
No,
the
it doesn't.
left. You had a lot of people that were getting rich, either their families were getting rich, or some investment they were doing was making them rich, or the companies that were in their districts were getting rich. So somewhere along the way is being financially enriched by having this tie to the Chinese Communist Party, and that's why they continue to do it.
And who specifically? Nowadays, I mean, I think we can definitely say Mitch McConnell. You reference him in the book and his wife in the book. Who else in our government?
Well, in the book I reference Mitch McConnell and his wife Elaine Chao, and Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. There are a number of others. Most of what happens today in politics is really without the full knowledge and consent of the politicians themselves. They're encouraged to do things. For instance, we had a base commander at Nellis Air Force Base that was approached by the mayor of Las Vegas, asking him not to say anything about the factory that China was building off the departure end of Nellis Air Force Base. And that's because he was concerned about the jobs that factory was going to provide for Las Vegas residents. So, in a way, the Chinese Communist Party used the fact that they can invest in our society as ways to curry political favor with politicians. Same thing happened with the Foxconn factory in Wisconsin. It's really about currying that political favor with politicians by finding a way that they can be incentivized.
So, would you say that many of our politicians in China's pocket are they just ignorant, or are some of them overtly on the other team?
They're some are overtly on the other team. Most of those are like lobbyists or lawyers that are working for pay on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, lobbying our political
Hmm.
institutions. But some of them are in politics, are getting incentivized. The case of Hunter Biden and Joe Biden was really about Hunter Biden making money, and you through that relationship with his father, transferring that money to the father. So it's some of it can be like that, but most of it is really coming through lobbyists in law firms that lobby
Yeah.
the United States.
So President Biden, is he? I think that his son Hunter definitely overtly on the other team, uh, but President perhaps just a little ignorant, or is he on the other team?
Well, I think yes. I mean, look, there was a lot, and I tend not to place blame in people because I too really didn't understand the threat from the Chinese Communist Party. So in a sense, as citizens, we're all responsible, but it's what we do from the point that we recognize the challenge. Do we stand up and do we do something about it, or do we not? And when I really realized for the first time that this was going on, I determined that I had to stand up and do something. And every day I see Americans standing up to basically say, I recognize this threat. I'm going to take action to help mitigate it.
Let's discuss briefly the Muslim Uyghurs. Uyghurs is how you say it, correct? And the genocide that President Xi is committing against this entire population is. I have been dying to ask this question for months. Is there a parallel between that and what the Nazis did with the Jews? Like, is it at all inappropriate to compare modern day China and what they do to the Muslim population to Nazi Germany? Is it at all inappropriate, General Spalding?
No, it's not. I mean, one of the things that the Chinese Communist Party did was vilify Muslims within China. So just like the Nazis vilified the Jews within Germany, and then they started putting them in concentration camps. They do things like forced organ harvesting, where they'll take people that are in prison and then they will sell their organs to the highest bidder. So these are things that are horrendous, and can be compared very closely to the way that the Nazis treated the Jewish people. Unfortunately, today in this globalized internet connected world, you have U.S. corporations that are in many ways aiding and abetting that behavior. For example, the recent movie from Disney, Mulan, at the very end of the movie, there's credits thanking the police, the Public Security Bureau in Xinjiang for supporting them on the movie. Now, this is the same organization that's putting the Uyghurs in concentration camps. So, as you can see, we have corporations that are actually part and parcel to this activity because we have these closely connected economies.
Yeah, you know what's interesting too? These great activists like LeBron James, he complains on and on about how black people are being hunted down and how oppressed black people are. Meanwhile, he's profiting so heavily off of slave labor in China. I mean, LeBron James, will you, we hear everything you're saying on Twitter, but will you commit to not profiting off of slave labor anymore? Will you commit to not having any shoes or any of your apparel being made by slave labor in China? No, he won't do it. He won't acknowledge that. He won't even answer that. Does he even comprehend that at all? That he's profiting so greatly off of slave labor?
Of course, he comprehends it, and that's why he refused. In fact, he criticized Daryl Morey of the Houston Rockets for saying anything about Hong Kong. He said, "Hey, that's the Chinese. We shouldn't talk about what we don't know." So he's basically saying, "Don't mess with the fact that I'm making millions of dollars, and the NBA is making millions of dollars in China." By pointing out the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is oppressing the people of Hong Kong and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and the people of Tibet, and soon want to do the same thing to the people of Taiwan. No, he's making
Yes.
too much money, and this is the same problem, by the way, that's going on everywhere.
Yes, it really is. And the NBA has just been so funny with their virtue signaling. And I remember just turning on the NBA Finals last year. I guess what I don't know, October, whatever, and just seeing Black Lives Matter on the court everywhere. These social justicey statements on the back of their jerseys. It was really gross, to be honest. This is a Marxist organization in my eyes, the National Basketball Association, and meanwhile they're completely silent on genocide in China of Muslims. They're completely silent on that. So how is the NBA? I know how LeBron James is profiting off of China with his apparel. How is the NBA as a whole profiting off of China?
It's the same. It's the same way.
Okay.
They sell products there. Team apparel, but they also televise games there. They have ticket sales there, so they do exhibition games there. So it's the
Yes.
same way.
And I think that with these cable news networks, with these legacy news networks, they to have access. I correct me if I'm wrong here. To get access to, I mean, how many people are in China? A billion?
Oh, it was 1.4 billion, and
1.4
so
billion.
there's a lot of consumers. Yeah,
Huge market, a lot of
right,
consumers, and it's very profitable for stations like CNN and these other networks to get to have that shown in China to that many
right,
people. And
right.
so they have to sort of tailor their content to make it acceptable to the Chinese Communist Party. Is there any truth in that? Because that's what I have heard. Can you elaborate on it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that was what LeBron James was saying, was that we have to curtail what we say in order to not offend the Chinese Communist Party. And because what you saw is when Daryl Morey did that, they canceled the games, they took all the team paraphernalia off the team apparel off the site, so you couldn't sell any more NBA products. It was really they basically wholesale shut down the
Yes.
NBA in China. So yeah, and that's a devastating blow financially for the owners of the NBA. So this is a way that they have a stranglehold on American corporations.
Yeah. What about Muslim Uyghurs? Do you Why do they do this to them? Why do they treat them like this? Do they just think that they're inferior? Do what is it? I can't wrap my head around that. Why they're just doing this?
So in a lot of ways, it represents the arrival of a new leadership within the Chinese Communist Party. So one of the ways that they've done this in the past, Jiang Zemin did this with the Falun Gong, is really by demonstrating their ability to deal with, you know, a problem. The Uyghurs in Xinjiang were deemed a problem, and they related it to terrorism. So they said, excuse me, all of these people in Xinjiang were terrorists. And so, by the way, they did this to Tibet. They've now done it to Hong Kong as well, in terms of, suppressing the independence and freedom of these states. Xinjiang was called East Turkestan, and was actually invaded by the Chinese Communist Party, within days after declaring, standing up the People's Republic of China. So, the Uyghurs aren't a part of China. Xinjiang is a Chinese word for East Turkestan, and it's really about the people of East Turkestan aren't even Chinese. And in fact, what the Chinese Communist Party has done is to move Chinese people into East Turkestan to basically slowly erode the culture and the really the society of Muslims there.
General, have you heard anything about China's space force? Are you able to speak on that at all? Do you know much about that?
Yeah, they have a pretty significant and technologically sophisticated space force. I mean, they've landed drones on the dark side of the moon. So they are very, very technologically sophisticated across a whole number of areas, not just the space force.
Do you know about their ambitions with the space force? Do you know much about that? Because I was hearing General Steve Quast, I don't know if you know him, speak on China's Space Force, and it really struck a struck fear in me. Do you know much about it? Their ambition there?
He's much more knowledgeable about the Space Force, but they do seek to have preeminence in space. They seek to have preeminence on the moon. They seek to mine resources from the moon and from space, and to have dominance over those areas. So, I mean, this is something that they've been working on for a while, and they've taken most of the learning and technology from the United States.
Yes, and how have they done that? Paint a picture for people
Well, yeah,
how they've taken our
yeah.
information.
So they've worked with our labs, they work with our universities, they work with NASA. They get a lot of technology through that. They buy technology from our companies. They buy startups. And then they just flat out steal information. They'll break into computers in space companies and in NASA and download data. And then they'll send their students over to our universities and labs to learn from our professors um, during the early parts of their space industry. They actually got help, direct help from I think it was Hughes spacecraft, and I want to say that it was I can't remember the other company, but basically they helped them understand what was wrong with their rocket, and in so doing got the ability to create ICBM. So in many ways, they've incentivized the corporate sector, NASA and academia to help them transfer this technology.
Yes. As we begin to wrap up, I am very curious about this more of a very current recent event. Do you have any thoughts on these so-called Asian hate crimes, and do you suspect that there's any link to the CCP at all?
Well, the only link is really that the Chinese Communist Party uses any criticism of the party to basically turn it into racism. In other words, if you criticize the Chinese Communist
Mm-hmm.
Party, they're saying, well, you're just being racist against Chinese. So they use the tools of racism. They use it as a psychological and a ideological and really a rhetorical weapon to silence their critics.
Yeah, it is interesting. I was in a clubhouse room. I don't know if you're familiar with that
Yep.
audio app. Yes, and it was a room about China, and somebody was talking the facts about China, much like we have here today, and the genocide and the dangers of the CCP, whatnot. And a Chinese person got on the stage and started accusing the speakers of spewing this hatred towards Chinese people. And then if you actually looked around the room, it looked like there were some other Chinese bots slash spies in the room too, like some really sketchy profiles. And I said, wow, they're everywhere.
They literally are everywhere. And if you think about it, the Chinese government has the ability to pay, people to monitor social media and to begin to influence. And so one of the things that the Silicon Valley tech companies have given them is the ability to harness data for the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. So I say they don't use bombs and bullets; they use ones and zeros and dollars and
Yes.
cents. Those are their weapons.
Yeah, they can. They're in everyone's pocket. They pay everyone off. They pay people to to do what I just said. They pay people to be honey traps even.
Right.
And what can we do in general, General Spalding? What is talking solutions here in general? What can we do when I mean money talks?
Yeah.
I just got done saying no corporation in their right mind is going to slash their profits in half. On an individual level, it's the same thing. If you're offered, I don't know, a lot of money, you're gonna. A lot of people are gonna do just about anything for a good amount of money, if it's right, and it seems like the CCP has endless amounts of it. What is the solution here? Money talks. I mean, I don't. I feel like we're at a loss here. What can we do?
No, you have to make it illegal. I mean, that's what we did
Mm,
during the Cold War. You
mm,
just have to make it illegal. Companies will, they have actually a fiduciary responsibility. So by law, they have to make more money. So that's a responsibility of the directors and the executive officers of the company for any corporation. So we have to make it illegal, or else they
yes.
are incentivized to do this, not just for their own profit, but also by law. If they don't do what's best for the profits of the company, they can be removed.
General Spalding, my final question is, well, is time running out for us to take swift, decisive action? Is time
Well,
running out?
I thought we had more time, but 2020 really showed me that time is really of the essence. If you think about it, their ability to affect the political and social and economic system of the United States was absolutely devastating to our society in 2020. We have got to do this now. There is no more time to wait.
Unfortunately, I don't think that call is going to be answered, General Spalding, with who we have in the White House. Unfortunately, I don't think that there's any hope for any action to be taken until what 2025 at the earliest. So I don't know.
Well, I'm an American. I feel fervently. I support the Constitution. I believe in freedom and
Yes.
democracy. I'm going to continue to fight. I'm going to continue to speak up. I think people should speak up when they see things that are counter to our principles and values. And if we don't, then we deserve what we get.
Yeah. My friends, you have to get this book, Stealth War, subtitle How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. Have to get that book, Stealth War, on Amazon, on Audible. Uh, really a riveting book. At Robert_Spalding on Twitter. General Spalding, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.